Hello all, just popping together another video for your composition lesson today. This is kind of a second part to the video last week on development sections. Last week we divided a development section into two bits, a passage of motivic development and then a passage of dominant preparation, or sort of dominant prolongation. Today we're going to look at two more things that can happen in a recapitulation, in a development section. We're going to look at false recapitulations, so having a kind of a mini recapitulation in the wrong key in the middle of a development section. And we're going to also look at a development section which lands on the subdominant at the beginning of the recapitulation. Yes? So, right, let's just sort of move straight on to our first example. So this is the first subject of Beethoven's Opus 2 number 3. I'll just play it through so that you're relatively familiar with the material. Okay, super. So there's the first subject. You probably might recognise that, in fairness. I've used that as an example of a sentence structured phrase for our sort of melody writing bit of the course. So there it is, and this is the development section. So again, I'll play it through just so you've got a sense of what it sounds like. But as always, there are countless recordings of this online, so do go off and listen to the first movement. I think it's about 10 minutes or so long. Right, here's the development section. So there's the development. And again, we can divide that into a couple of little bits. So we have, first and foremost, we get this sort of rising sequence with this idea. And that eventually reaches this B flat 7 chord. And that kicks off this kind of section of quite rapid broken chord passage work. B flat dominant 7th is quite distant as well from our home key. We're in C major, and B flat dominant 7th is a fair distance away from around the circle of fifths. It's the dominant of E flat major, so it's like a third away, and yeah, it's quite difficult to kind of draw a link. I suppose you could think of E flat major as the relative major of the tonic minor, but we're still quite far away from our tonic key, so we need to spend some time working our way back. So that B flat 7 chord, we're now at a fair distance, and what we end up doing with these broken chords is we end up moving through a series of chromatic shifts. So we move from B flat 7 to a B diminished 7th, to an F minor chord in second inversion, to a C sharp major chord. That's, in fairness, that's a C sharp dominant 7th. And then we go to an F sharp minor chord, and then that lands on the A7, on A dominant 7th, the dominant 7th of D major. So I'm just going to sort of pop over to another slide here just to show you these sort of chromatics, these chromatic shifts, because we end up getting this rising chromatic line in the bass, and that gives us a sense of building tension here, and also these, I mean, the chords are quite closely constructed. We don't have many wide leaps. We're actually just moving one or two notes at a time. So if I just play through these chords like a kind of chorale, this is what we get. And then to our D major chord. So that's more or less what's going on. And then, right here, right at the very end of that, we get our first subject, but in D major. So again, it feels like a recapitulation. We've kind of like cadenced slightly onto D major. The dynamic markings have come down from sort of a fortissimo right the way down to a pianissimo. And that's reflective of the first subject. The first subject begins quite tentatively. The dynamic marking at the opening is piano, and now we've got our pianissimo restatement of the first subject, but in D major in the wrong key. So yeah, there's our sort of false recapitulation. But we move away from that quite rapidly. So we get a bit more. I think it's about 4 bars of first subject Greek material. This sort of. But then we get a kind of, we sort of violently move through a development of that material. And so on and so forth. So you can kind of see the end of that movement here. These sort of octaves that move, that sort of shift chromatically downwards until we end up on this diminished 7th chord, sort of 2B, 2-7B chord, which kicks off the dominant preparation. We have a long passage with a dominant pedal right the way through, culminating in a few bars right at the end where we've landed on a 5-7 chord. And we're just sort of working our way down through from that top F right the way down to the E above middle C. This is quite similar to that run at the end of the development section in the Pathetique Sonata, which we looked at last week. So here we've got this sort of our dominant preparation. And that kind of brings our development section to an end. You can see the beginning of the recapitulation here at the end of the very last bar of this extract. And I suppose, yeah, the key points here are this sort of rapid passage work that you get, which leads up to a false recapitulation, and then we get some little bits of motivic development, which leads into this sort of dominant preparation. Okay, so let's move on. We're going to move on to Mozart's sort of 16th piano sonata, K545. I'll just play you the first subject. I think a lot of you will have probably heard this before. It's quite a famous one. Here we go. So on and so forth. Okay, so there's the first subject. I'm just going to play through the development section for you now, just so again you've got some familiarity with it. so there's the development. It's a lot shorter than Beethoven's, in fairness. And again, we can divide it into 2 bits. So we've got a bit of passage work at the beginning. We've got some broken chord figures. And that starts off in G minor. It's kind of where we've landed at the end of the exposition. And we get a kind of 1, 5, 7, 1 in G minor, and then a 1, 5, 7, 1 in D minor. Okay, there we go. And then we end up with a kind of circle of fifths progression. So we end up with A minor, D minor, to G, to C, down to F. And then here we have a bit of a change. We would expect B flat, and then E flat, and then A flat. But I think Mozart does want to, we can't have a circle of fifths go on forever. So that's where there's a slight alteration. So we get a B diminished chord, which leads to an E, and then to an A minor chord. And then, instead of trying to land on the tonic, we end up landing on the subdominant. We land on a D in the bass, and instead of having D minor here again, we have chord 4B of F major. So we've got a B flat major chord here, and that leads onto a 5-7 chord, which then lands on 1 of F major. So we get this recapitulation in the subdominant. What I might do, just so you've got, I might just play through those circle of fifths chords, just so they're kind of there in your head. So we get this broadly. And then finally this sort of shift, and then okay, so that's more or less the harmonic structure of this of the second half of this development section. So the recapitulation here is it starts in the subdominant. We get the first subject in the subdominant, and so what Mozart's doing is he's kind of decreasing the tension without entirely resolving it. Here, the recapitulation, we don't get that sense of resolution right at the beginning of the recapitulation. We get a sense that the tension is decreased, but it's not entirely dissipated. And that's because, we talked about this, I think, a couple of weeks ago, but when we're moving through the circle of fifths, if we're moving clockwise around the circle of fifths and visiting sharper keys, we're building tension. We can say that we're building harmonic tension. But if we're visiting flatter keys, we can say that we're sort of decreasing tension. That those keys are a little bit less tense. And so what Mozart's doing here is, instead of landing on the tonic and kind of completely resolving the tension, we're just taking a sidestep to the subdominant, to F, before landing on C major in the recapitulation of the second subject, which is where the tension is finally resolved. That tension built up by landing on the dominant in the second subject of the exposition and sets up the sonata form is decreased by landing on the subdominant in the first subject group of the recapitulation, and then it's finally resolved when we get to the tonic on the second subject group of the recapitulation. So yeah, it sort of shifts the weight of the movement. If you imagine that, we're kind of aiming for that goal, sort of resolving the tension, that goal is shifted back. Instead of being right at the beginning of the recap, it's now a little bit later in the recapitulation. So yeah, that's what Mozart's doing broadly. Okay, so how might you use some of this in your own work? Well, you might consider having some passage work in your development section. I think sometimes it can be quite difficult to sort of fragment or to motivically develop all of your ideas. And so if you're looking for a way of extending a development section and you don't necessarily want to find another way of fragmenting a subject, or maybe like one of your subjects, it doesn't lend itself very well to motivic development, then having some passage work in the development section is fine. Beethoven's done it with those broken chords. Mozart's done it with these sort of scalic passages in the circular fifth section, and indeed with some broken chords at the beginning of his development section. But that's absolutely okay. I would try to sort of liven it up a little bit. So maybe if you're going to put in some passage work, you'll definitely need some motivic development alongside it. And maybe the passage work could do something interesting harmonically as well. So it could have some chromatic voice leading, or maybe it could have an adapted circular fifths progression. But passage work, totally fine in a development. You might also include a false recapitulation. That could be a way of making a development section more exciting by including a recap which seems to resolve the tension but actually doesn't. We're in the wrong key and we need to keep going until we land on the right key. Or you might shift the weight of your movement to later on to the second subject, or indeed to a coda, by starting your recapitulation in the subdominant. So there's a few ideas anyway. I hope this has proved useful. And yeah, again, do let me know if there are any topics you want me to cover in another video. And yeah, I look forward to seeing your work and look forward to seeing you after half term. Cheers, bye.